All right, good morning, everybody. I want to thank the two gentlemen for helping pass out this week's handouts. I'm a little bit constrained this week. And no, y'all know I have a back entry. I've been clearing brush along a fence row and just overdid a little bit. So when I do that, I wind up paying for it a couple of days. The bad news is I've only done about 3% of the fence row that needs to be cleared. Yeah. The people we bought the property from, part of their reason for moving is that they had two small kids and they just couldn't keep up with stuff like that. So I don't know how many years it's been since the fence row was cleared, but there was a lot there. All right, this morning we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 8. Now, I'm going to show you a picture here in a second that is not just meant to amuse. There's actually a purpose. So I'm going to go back to it later in the class. So see if you can anticipate where this will actually have something to do with the class. All right? Okay, but 1 Samuel chapter 8. Now, we start off with Samuel making his sons to be judges. Now, we talked before that in the book of Judges, and usually in most of the Old Testament, when you talk about a judge, you're not talking about someone handling legal cases. You're talking about someone who led the people and saved them from an oppressor. This is one of the few times where it looks pretty certain they are talking about handling legal cases. So Samuel took his two boys and made them judges in a legal sense. Way down south in Beersheba, if you think about what the nation of Israel looks like, you know how it kind of comes to a triangle and a sharp point at the south end? Well, way down there, that's where Beersheba was. There weren't very many people, and I kind of get the feeling that maybe Samuel's sons were auditioning for a greater role in the future. You know, put them someplace that's small, there's not a lot of people. If they mess it up, they can't hurt too many, and let's just see how they do. Well, as it turned out, they were corrupt. We'll get more to that in a moment. But what I want you to notice is this is the first time that a leader in the Bible, in the Old Testament, has chosen his sons to succeed him. That has never happened before. Now, the kind of exception would be the role of the high priest, because when the high priest dies, who becomes the high priest? His oldest son. Now, the difference with that, though, is that God decreed that succession. We don't see God's involvement in this. It kind of sounds like Samuel did it on its own. And I kind of think that Samuel was making a mistake here. In Judges chapter 8, the people of Israel told Gideon, who'd been a huge success as a judge, they told Gideon, make your son to be the judge after you. And Gideon refused to do it. The judges were men who had lives. They were doing other things. And God grabbed a hold of them and said, go save my people. It's kind of like when you read in the book of Amos. I love this passage. You know, Amos was up preaching up north. He was from way down south. He was preaching up north. And he was accused of being in it just for money and was told to go on home and collect your paycheck. And he looked at the fellow and said, I was not a prophet, nor did I train to be a prophet. I was a farmer. I was following a plow, and I was happy doing so, but the Lord seized me. That Hebrew word is usually translated took hold. It's stronger than that. The Lord seized me and said, go prophesy. That is kind of how the judges were chosen. They had lives, and God grabbed a hold of them and said, my people need to be saved. You're the Savior. That's not what's happening here. Samuel is trying to set his sons up, and I kind of think that this was probably a mistake. And as it turns out, his sons were corrupt. Now, Mr. Jerry pointed out to us a couple weeks ago that this is the third time that a major character, Aaron, Eli, and now Samuel, a major character that we would think of typically as a godly man, has sons turn out ungodly. And whether it's because dad got too wrapped up in ministry or the sons just chose to go, we'll never know. But the bottom line is the sons were corrupt. And it specifically says, look at verse 3, they took bribes and perverted justice. Now, I want you to look at a couple places in the law with me. Look back at Leviticus chapter 19. Leviticus 19 and verse 15. You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. Now, Exodus chapter 23. Exodus 23, verses 6 and 7. You shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. It's no exaggeration to say that God detests corruption in a legal system. There's a lot of reasons for that. First of all, I don't know any way to destroy a nation than by corrupting its legal system. It's about the fastest way. You want to ruin a place, corrupt the legal system. As long as people feel like they have a fair shot and the law is applied to everyone equally, everybody trusts the courts, and that serves as something that binds you together. But what if the courts start to become a place where the wealthy and connected always get off? Or maybe aren't even charged because they belong to the same group as those running the courts? And what if those that are not part of that group get prosecuted for minor things that nobody else ever gets charged with? But boy, they'll charge you because you're not part of the in crowd. You start doing things like that and it'll tear a country apart. And here's what's even worse. Corruption always lands on the poor. Now think about it for a minute. Who can pay bribes? It's not poor people. Corruption always winds up harming the poor, and you know as well as I do that God loves the poor. The Old Testament is full of that. Look at the prophets. And corruption always winds up landing on the poor. So it may not sound like that big a deal that here's Samuel's two sons, they're way down south, there's not that many people, they can't do that much. Okay, that's kind of true. But look what they're doing. They're taking bribes and perverting justice. Now, what if this was an audition for a greater role? And what if they succeeded to a position somewhere far up north in one of the big towns? What if, God forbid, one of them succeeded Samuel as priest? This is not a minor thing that happened, even though it happened in a minor location. This is important because it shows their character, and it helps lead to then what's coming next, the demand for a king. Verse 4, the elders of Israel gathered together, came to Samuel and said to him, behold, you're old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. It's a polite way of saying they are corrupt jerks. They're not like you. We don't want them leading us. So they demand a king. Now let's spend a little bit here real quick and just run over the role of a king in the ancient Near East. And I'm drawing this for not just from Israel, but also the nations around Israel, okay? Typically, a king had limitless power and authority. Nobody could tell a king, you can't do that. He could do whatever he wanted. And you see some of this in the Old Testament. You remember the story of Ahab and Naboth? Anybody remember that one? Ahab was king of the north, after the Israel split, north and south, the northern kingdom of Israel, Ahab was king up there. Naboth had a vineyard that sounds like right next to the palace, because Ahab wanted the land to plant a garden next to where he lived. And Naboth says, like, I'm not going to sell it to you. It was given to me by I inherited it from my dad, who inherited it from his dad. It was property that had been given to his family by God when the land was divided among the tribes. And he didn't want to let go of it. And so Ahab basically went to his room and pouted for about a week. And his wife Jezebel comes to him and says, stop this, you're the king. And they trumped up charges against Naboth that had him executed for blasphemy and treason. And then guess who got the land? And who's going to tell Ahab and Jezebel, you can't do that? Anybody that tried would have been executed right next to Naboth. That's the kind of power that a king had in the ancient Near East. They also were viewed as having divine support for their rule. They were chosen and upheld by the gods of whatever nation they ruled. And even, you see that some in Israel. Weren't some of the kings of Israel and Judah directly chosen by God? Now, in the southern kingdom, the kingship remained in David's family up till the very end. But in the north, the dynasties changed several times as somebody would become corrupt and somebody else would overthrow him and start a new dynasty. Several times the man that started the new dynasty was anointed by a prophet. In other words, chosen by God to kind of start this over, and hopefully this one will do good. So, divine support for their rule. The kings were expected to preserve order and justice. You remember the story of Solomon and the two women who were fighting over the baby? Two women both had babies. One of them's child died in the night, and she apparently stole the other one's child and put the dead child with the first woman. And they were arguing over who was actually the mother to the living child. And the case wound up with Solomon, because the king, for lack of a better term, served as the Supreme Court. He was the ultimate tribunal for difficult cases. Of course, you remember how that one wound up. Solomon said, okay, let's just take a sword and cut the child in half. And then you can each have half of him. And one of the women said, sounds fine to me. And the other one says, oh, no, let her have it. And Solomon says, the woman that cried out is the mother. The woman who is willing to let the child die is not. Now, but Solomon was serving as the last voice of justice and order. Kings often had priestly duties. They were frequently depicted as shepherds, not just in the Bible, but outside in the countries surrounding Israel. They were military leaders. They were to protect the kingdom or deliver the kingdom from an invader. And they were expected to expand the kingdom through trade or conquest, bringing in goods or plunder. They're bringing in slave labor, things that would help their people have more and live easier. Now, you won't be surprised that the reality of a king was often less than the ideal. Those things I mentioned may not sound all that bad, but every one of them could be perverted and corrupted, and they usually were. And you frequently see that with the kings of Israel, for example, and some of the kings of the southern kingdom, Judah. So all the elders, these are the leaders of the communities throughout the land of Israel, all the elders come to Samuel and say, we want a king. The stated reason is the corruption of Samuel's sons. Now this is, to me, this is supremely ironic. Eli's sons were corrupt and weren't good enough to follow him, right? Samuel's sons are corrupt and aren't good enough to follow him. So our answer is to have a king whose son will follow him. What guarantee have you got that he's going to be any better than Samuel and Eli's boys? And history shows us that frequently the sons were worse than their fathers. The fathers turn bad and they raise a boy who's worse because he starts off with a worse example. So anyway, but they demand a king. And apparently the desire was pretty widespread, because notice what it says here, verse 4, all the elders of Israel. Even if you want to consider that a little bit of an exaggeration, I don't particularly, but even if you wanted to, you still get the impression that the desire for a king is spread throughout the entire country. I think part of what's driving this is that up to now, they've been a loose federation of tribes. There's no central government. So when an oppressor comes in and conquers and part or all of the land, they can't raise an army until a whole lot of damage has been done, because the judge wasn't chosen and raised up by God until somebody had already come in and take over. But if you've got a king with a standing army, then maybe you can fight him off before he takes over. So that appears to be part of what was motivating them. They wanted someone who could guarantee their safety, or they thought. Now, to my mind, they have committed a category error. They thought they had a political problem. We're not organized enough. We need one guy in charge of everything all the time. They thought they had a political problem, so they proposed a political solution. Let's have a king. What they've actually got is a spiritual problem. Because you remember back when we were talking about Deuteronomy and the blessings and the curses, talked about that last week, right? If they had followed the law and lived the way God intended, there wouldn't be any oppressors, ever. There would be nothing but blessings. Everything you ever want will be yours. So you can pretty well sum up the blessings that way. So they think they've got a political problem. They propose a political solution. The problem is spiritual, and they're totally neglecting the spiritual side of things. If they'd simply followed the law, they wouldn't have had any problems. But anyway, they demand a king. And you notice that Samuel takes it personally. Now, partly maybe because of his sons, a little bit of it was personal. But see, this is where our picture comes in. This is Samuel's reaction. He is not pleased with what the people had proposed. So he goes to God basically to complain about it. And God says, no, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. Now think about this for a second. If the king is good and obedient, then he is only going to do what God would have done in the first place, right? In other words, he's not necessary because God would have led them in the same way. But the moment the king becomes disobedient and does what he wants, then he's in rebellion against God, isn't he? So in effect, this demand for a king, it's kind of a form of treason against God. Because the king is either unnecessary or he's going to lead the people away from God, rebel against God. Those are your only two choices. Either not necessary or rebelling against God. And that's what the people have decided they want. They're also kind of maybe making the accusation that God hasn't been doing a very good job of things. Because again, we don't get a Savior to arise and drive off the oppressor until we've suffered. We want someone who can keep us from suffering. Remember what I said? They're ignoring the spiritual problem. They wouldn't have been suffering if they'd been obedient. But they don't see it that way. So in effect, they're saying, we want someone who'll be here all the time, central authority and standing army, and can take care of things before they arise. He'll do a better job than God has been doing, is kind of the implication here. Now, if this desire for a king was a bad thing, and I think it was, the things we've already talked about, and then you look on through the rest of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, how did that kingship thing work out for him? I would just off the top of my head, I would tell you the bad kings outnumber the good ones 2-1. And the ratio may be worse than that. Kingship didn't work out very well. So why did God let them do it? Sometimes we got to learn the hard way. Okay? And the hardness of their hearts. You know what it all really boils down to? You're determined to do something, God will let you. Our freedom is a scary thing sometimes. We can choose to serve God with all of our hearts, or we can choose to ignore Him with all of our heart. And God will let you do He'll let you have your way. Now sometimes, and Everett, I think you were kind of hinting at this, sometimes we finally wake up and realize we've been butting our heads against the wall, and we'll turn back to God. And you know what the amazing thing is? He's there to meet us. I mean, isn't that what the story of the prodigal son was about? Don't you think that father knew that it was bad to give that boy a bag full of money and send him on his way? That wasn't a smart thing to do. And the father knew that, but he did it anyway. Why? Okay, I'm sorry. Siri apparently is listening to me. All right. Usually you have to touch something to make that happen. I have no idea what happened. But the father knew that his son was going to get himself in trouble. But he let the boy have his way because the boy was determined to do it. And I'm sure that somewhere in the back of his mind, the father was just praying and hoping that one day the kid would come to his senses. Well, one day the kid did come to his senses. And he heads back home. And who's running down the driveway to meet him? Now, that parable is one that's pretty easy to understand, right? Who's the prodigal son? We are, all of us. And who's the dad running down the driveway? So God will let us have our way, but he's always there to meet us when we finally realize that his way is better. All right, down to about verse 10. God tells them to let him have a king. Tells Samuel, let them have a king. But he also tells them you need to warn them what they're getting into. And this is a classic case of be careful what you wish for. They want kingship and they want a central government, okay? That's going to require a supporting staff and administration that will have no end. Folks, bureaucracy that lasts forever and metastasizes like cancer is not new. I mean, I feel like I just described our government. But that's not new. Any government ever has always found a way to perpetuate itself and grow. That's just the nature of it because human beings are involved in it. And we may dress different and talk different from the way they did 3,000 years ago, but we're not that much different. That's part of why the Bible is still applicable. And these stories we read in the Bible, it's why it's still applicable. They may dress different, they may have different technology, but they're people just like us. So here's what's going to happen because they've decided they want a king. They've not had chariots before. Well, now they will, with all the costs that come with maintaining those and the horses and everything else. They never had a standing army before. Well, now they will, and it's got to be fed and housed and equipped. You're going to have a royal palace because you can't expect a king to live in a normal home, right? Well, that's going to require bakers and tailors and washerwomen and people to maintain the grounds and all kinds of other stuff. There's going to be hundreds of people required to keep that household functioning. The king will confiscate property to give to his cronies because you got to reward the people that support you or they might stop supporting you. Anything the king sees that catches his eye is going to become his. He's out taking a ride and he sees your nice horse. You know, I'd like to have that horse. Well, it's going to mysteriously, magically find its way into his stable. And you may or may not get paid for it. And you won't have any choice in the matter because the king wants it. And someone's going to have to pay for all of this stuff. And it's going to be the very people demanding a king. They're going to have to serve themselves in the army or as forced labor. Samuel says the king is going to take your children for the same reasons, to serve in the army or as forced labor. He's going to tax everything that you own, everything that you produce. Catch that. Now we have in this country an income tax, right? Samuel's saying you're going to have that plus what's called a wealth tax. We're not just going to tax, he's not just going to tax what you produce, he's going to tax what you own, your wealth. Anything that you've accumulated can be taxed. Verse 17, he sums it up by saying, you shall be his slaves. From everything we've described, that sounds pretty accurate, doesn't it? Now, and all of this, by the way, is going to be on top of the tithe that's owed to the Lord to support the temple and the priesthood. So, in effect, Samuel is saying, okay, you want a military leader and you want a judge. But to get that, you're going to have to accept the entire package, all this stuff that you probably haven't thought of. And isn't that the way sin works? We have an immediate, there's something we want. And it probably doesn't seem that big a deal to us. And in the great scheme of life, maybe it's not that big a deal. But what we don't see is all the stuff that's going to come with it. That's going to get dragged into the what we think is a relatively minor sin. It's just the nature of sin. It always spreads farther and infects far more than we ever thought it would. I want this car, I want this house, I want this new job. And I got to undercut somebody at work to get it. I'm going to have to figure out some way to make him look bad so that I get the promotion and he doesn't. All right, well, I get the promotion. Then what am I going to have to deal with? All the people that know what I've done and who now are drawing conclusions about my character. Some of them are going to be out to get me. Some of them are going to come with further temptations because I've already proved that I'm the kind of guy that'll do that sort of thing. Didn't have any of that in mind. I just want the promotion. But there's always baggage attached that you never expect. And by the way, everything that Samuel talks about here, you see it borne out graphically about a generation away in the reigns of Solomon and Rehoboam. Solomon spent his whole life with Jerusalem under construction. The temple, palaces for all the gods that his foreign wives brought in, roads. I mean, every time you turn around in the scriptures, it's like every other verse is describing something else that Solomon is building. Well, where did the labor come from? Because Solomon didn't fight wars. So he wasn't conquering people who could be slaves and do the work for him. Where did the labor come from? They drafted the people of Israel. Many of them against their will. They had no choice. When the king's, whatever he was called, came through town and his quota was 15 people out of this village, he just started pointing. The 15 healthiest looking men were rounded up and taken off to Jerusalem to work. Now, they may or may not have been compensated. We don't know how that worked. It's possible they weren't. But none of it was by choice. And it was a heavy, heavy burden on the people. So when Solomon finally dies and his son Rehoboam takes over, the people come to him and say, your daddy was hard on us. And it's been tough these past few years, and we're begging you, give us some relief. So Rehoboam consults his advisors, who are the holdovers from Solomon's day. And the advisors say, if you'll give the people some relief, they will love you forever. And then Rehoboam talks to the snotty brats who is of his own age. And they tell him, don't you let those lazy people get away with this. Don't you give in to them. You tell them, you think my daddy was hard, I'll be harder still. And that's what Rehoboam did, because remember, no one can tell a king no. So Rehoboam goes out there, and I'm not going to get into it, but let's just say that his reply was obscene, because it truly was. If you read what he actually said, you read the Hebrew of what he actually said, his answer was obscene. Told the people, you think my dad was hard, you haven't seen anything yet. So what happens? Jeroboam takes 10 tribes and breaks off and forms a new kingdom. Because Rehoboam was a jerk who thought he could have anything and do anything because he was the king. Everything that Samuel said that would be bad about the kingship, you have crystallized right there in the story of Solomon and Rehoboam. But the people keep insisting. And now we get down to what I think maybe really was the heart of the matter. Look down at verse 19. The people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, no, there shall be a king over us, that we may be like all the other nations. And that our king may judge us and go before us and fight our battles. Now, they're wanting to make it sound like we just want someone to fight our battles and be a judge over us. We want a central authority that we all know and respect who can take care of us. That's what they're dressing it up as. Did you catch what their real motive was, though? We want to be like all the nations around us. What does Romans chapter 12, verse 2 say? Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. I understand those people hadn't heard Romans 12, verse 2, but they're breaking it. Their desire to be like everybody else has caused them to turn their backs on God and to demand a system that is going to harm them repeatedly for generations because they wanted to be like everybody else. Now, I'm not going to belabor this point, but we all know better than that, don't we? How many of you had a mom that said, well, if so-and-so jumps off the bridge, are you going to jump with him? I don't know why that was my mom's favorite. It was always jumping off a bridge. But that was the one I heard. Yeah, isn't that mom's way of saying don't be conformed to everyone like you? I mean, to everyone around you? Being like everyone around you is going to make you like everyone around you. And take a look at their lives. That's not what you want. And yet we still struggle with it, don't we? And we get back to the scary thing again. When we decide that we want to be like everyone around us, what does God do? If you insist, he'll let you have your way. But again, when you finally come back to your senses, he'll be there to meet you. All right, that's all I've got this morning. Next week, we'll take a look at the anointing of Saul. It's 3 chapters, so a little longer this time, chapters 9, 10, and 11. So take a look at those before next Sunday, and we'll see you then.